I appreciate your patience. There was a group of people interested in joining the church. They were having a meeting today. They started at 4 o'clock, and so they're still eating. So we decided to let them eat, and we'd come in here. So I appreciate you coming to find us. Tonight's time, if you remember, the way we wanted to treat this class is I first started you with some theory and some theology, and we kind of looked at some broad things, some assumptions that we could all agree with. And we even talked about some of the different ways Christians do counseling. And I even said, no matter where you would fit on that continuum, I think we can live with we could all have the same assumptions about the inerrancy of Scripture and the fact. And so we went through all those assumptions. We talked about a theological understanding of kind of soul care and what that might look like. And then I told you that what we're going to do is just take the 10 topics that I think pastors have told me over the years, this is what they deal with most often, and we just would talk about each of those. And so we started with depression, then we talked about anxiety, then we talked about addiction, three of those things that kind of focus on those areas. Tonight's a little different because it's going to be a little bit more broad. It's hard to say it's one topic, but I think it's something you have to be there has to be some significant awareness about. And so when people talk about, we're going to end up kind of filtering into talking about things like pornography tonight and sexuality and kind of what goes on with, when you do counseling with couples and kind of this whole idea of kind of gender and sexuality. And I can't think of a more Presbyterian thing than to have an old, chubby, bald man in his 60s talk about sex. I can't think of that might be the most Presbyterian thing that's ever happened on the face of this earth, that you would have the topic that probably everybody's interested in the world, to have kind of a chubby old bald man talking about it is probably not what you'd hope, but that's what you've got for tonight. So let me say a prayer for us, and then we'll kind of jump into this. Dear Father, we do want to be people who, we're just surprised so often that you trust us like you do. You trust us in the lives of each other. You trust us with your message of hope. You just trust us with this grand story of redemption. And Father, we have all messed that up so much, and so as we come together tonight, this little group wants to be faithful to you, to your word, and your calling. I pray that you would use this time to train and to teach. And Father, some of these ideas will be mine, and Father, let those go lightly. But the things that would come from you and your truth, I pray that would stick with us as we think about caring for others. Father, it must cause you great sadness to see the way our world the way Satan has so twisted what you put together in the idea of gender and sexuality and maleness and femaleness, and the beauty of the way that you created, and the way that we have, the way Satan has really sold such a cheaper product. So I pray you would connect with us tonight and use this time to change us. I pray in the powerful name of Jesus. Amen. Some of the things I'm going to say tonight would not be radical 15 years ago, 20 years ago. Today, I would lose my job in a secular academic setting for just kind of having a conversation about what we're going to talk about. And it seems like, how did that happen? I mean, how did we go from our society just 20, 30 years ago to a place today where literally the material that I'm going to present to you, I don't think you'll see it to be radical at all. But it would literally cost the job of someone in secular academia to have this sort of conversation about sexuality and gender. So having said that, let's just slow down just a little bit and just give you just a little bit of history. What happened? Some of what happened is the fault of my generation. There was a time when there was room to have good conversations, and there was room for conversations about things like homosexuality and gender and maleness and femaleness. And my generation did not do a very good job engaging the culture with a biblical understanding of it at all. I remember something 20 years ago on a Larry King live show that I just dated myself to most everybody in this room. There used to be a guy on CNN named Larry King, and he interviewed people, and he was doing a thing about homosexuality. And he had a Christian thinker on there, and he had some kind of gay rights activists on, and I saw in that moment how we had lost the discussion, because we made gender a discussion about us, and so the guy, the gay rights activist said, "Listen, I don't know why they're so angry with us. I just want to give health care to the person I love. Why would they be against me providing health care, just like they can for the person they love? Why would they be against that?" And Larry King turned to the Christian person and said, "So what do you think about that?" And his answer was, "Well, it's Adam and Eve, not Larry and Steve." And I thought, we have something better to say than that. We have a lot better to say than that. I mean, I wish he'd said, "Listen, I don't care who gets health care. We don't believe gender is a social construct. We believe gender is a theological construct. We believe that the Bible says something about the very nature of God, about through masculinity and through femininity, and we believe that that's a theological concept, not a social construct." And so, I hope they get all the health care they want. We're not here to fight about health care. We're here to suggest to you that for us, marriage is a sacred act that demonstrates the way Christ loved the church. That for us, we don't measure marriage by happiness necessarily, though God doesn't want us to be unhappy in our marriages. We measure it by a theological construct of what it means theologically and biblically in our worldview. And if he'd said that, I think, but instead it just became real petty. And we let the world determine the way we would do the arguments. And it got and it was really sad. I remember we were living in Orlando, and my wife worked for Habitat for Humanity in Orlando. She was the director of volunteer services. And her boss, the head of Habitat for Humanity, was a gay man who was a gay rights activist. And I'm backing up 10 years here. So there was a petition to put gay marriage on the ballot in Florida maybe 10 or 12 years ago. And so our church asked it to sign petitions, and we signed those petitions. And so Mona got the job, she's working there. And after about 3 or 4 months with this boss, Mona kind of won him over, because Mona's just an incredible woman. She has a way of kind of getting people to realize that they ought to smile every once in a while. And he said, "I'm really surprised that we're getting along and working so well." She goes, "Well, why is that?" And he said, "Well," and then he pulled out his wallet, and out of his wallet he pulled a page that he'd been keeping on the public record of who signs the petition, because it's a public record, and he had that with Mona's name circled. So, "Because you signed this, and you don't want me to be happy." And Mona said, "Oh, it's got nothing to do with me not wanting you to be happy. We believe," and she just described a biblical view of marriage. She said, "It's, if you also want to do a public ceremony, but if you want to use our sacred language to talk about your union, you don't understand. It says something about how we see God and how we see relationship and how we see covenant and how we see commitment. She went on to explain to them the idea of the way that God created in a complementary way. That if you just look at creation, you see this beautiful dance of dark and light, of sea and land. I mean, this complementary way in which one complements the other, and one complements the other. And each way in which God created has this beautiful dynamic of complementarian peace. And by the way, some of the most beautiful places are where those complementary pieces meet. A sunrise and a sunset is when light and dark meet. The ocean, the ocean, when you're at the ocean beach, that's where sea and land meet. There's incredible beauty in the design that God created in creation that has incredible dignity to it and beauty to it. And it's in a complementary way that he created. So I'm going to just explain that to him. And said, so we believe marriage is a picture of that. And the Bible goes as far to say is that we can see the way Christ loves a church by the way a man is supposed to love a woman in a marriage. And so it really doesn't have anything to do with you. It has to do with the sacredness that we see it. It's just like communion is a sacred thing to us. And if you came in and said, hey, we're going to do our own, we're going to take wine and bread and we're going to make it mean something completely different and we're just going to use it as our own ritual, we would say, wait a minute, get your own stuff. I mean, this is our sacred stuff. The guy, tear in his eye, said, I've been fighting you all for the last decade. This is the first time anybody's ever explained to me why you all feel the way you do. And then he said, and that makes sense to me. And so the first thing I want to say is that part of the problem with gender in America today, my generation of Christians need to take some responsibility. Because we had an opportunity to talk about the sacredness and the beauty of God's creation and design, and instead we turned it into, you're not allowed to have health insurance. When that's not really our issue. Our issue is the sacredness. And so my generation needs to take we made some terrible mistakes in help setting up the problem. Also, you need to also understand the context of what's going on as we live today in a postmodern society. And you know what that means. In the earliest of times, most people lived in what would be called, in many societies around the world, still live in a traditional society, meaning that they believe that their sacred records are where you get truth. And that's what we still believe, that where you get truth is from the Bible. And that's traditionalism. Where do I find truth? It's revealed to me from God. And that's what most societies, even non-Christian societies, even pagan societies, that's what most societies believe. It's like these are our traditions, these are our histories. And so that's where you get truth is from your history, and that's traditionalism. The reason Reformed theology, one of the things that Reformed theology that took off is Reformed theology started during the beginning of modernism. And modernism was the sense that where you get truth is from your thinking, from rational thought, or from empiricism, from experiments. And so the age of science, or the age of enlightenment, as it was called, is when the Reformation started. And basically everybody started to try to describe and explain the world outside of an understanding of God. And Reformed theology came along and said, wait a minute, you don't have to give up your cognition, you don't have to give up to be a good thinker to believe what we believe. And so Reformed theology was really at the apex of, as our society was changing from a traditional understanding of where truth comes from to a modernistic way of where it comes from. And in a modernistic understanding reality is that empiricism, and I know this is all theoretical. Just give me a second, and we'll kind of get back down to what does this all mean. But in a modernistic society, empiricism or the science or rationalism is what determines truth. And so it's people's ideas and people's experiments determines what's true. And Reformed theology came along and said, hey, we're not anti-cognition. I mean, we're pretty smart people, and we've got our way of seeing things. And so part of the way that Reformed theology really spread was it spoke the truth of the Bible into a shift in the way people saw reality. Does that make sense? Now, the third shift that we're in today is postmodernism. After modernism. They were up all night thinking of the name of it. So I said, what can we call it? It's after modernity. We'll call it postmodernity. And basically, in the postmodern society, what determines truth is your experience. And so that's why you hear those crazy things today like, well, you've got your truth and I've got my truth. Or even the idea that I can determine truth by what I feel. Or I can determine truth by, so I might have been born a male, but I don't feel like a male, and therefore I'm not really a male. I can identify as a female, and therefore that's true. Now, if you'd said that to my grandfather 25 years ago, he would say, that's crazy. That's crazy. There has to be some standard of truth. But I mean, you go to anything other than the hardest of sciences in modern academia today, and you'll hear things like, well, I'm quoting a professor that I know, and he said, well, there's no such thing as a capital T truth. And that's postmodernism. And so if you want to kind of know what's happened, why we have such an odd understanding of sexuality in our culture today, you've got to understand that Christian thinkers kind of messed up when some of this was starting. We live in a postmodern society. And then third, a very subtle thing happened in academia about 25 years ago. And they began using the words of civil rights to talk about sexuality. And so they would say that person is a member of a sexual minority. And you think, well, there's nothing wrong with that kind of terminology. You know, they are a minority. The truth is that homosexuality would be 3 to 5, maybe 7%, depending on the survey you look at. And so it is a minority in terms of the population. Transgenderism, up until recently, was 0.5%, which would be, in America, about 700,000 people. Now, I'm not saying those 700,000 people aren't important, but there's more people that are autistic than 0.5%. And there's more people that, and so all that to say, what happened is when in academia they started using the language of civil rights when it came to sexuality, that changed things. It's no longer a moral issue. So I'm a psychologist, and so my license, I'm not allowed to treat. If an African-American person comes in to see me, I cannot treat them and say, I just don't get along with people that are black. And so, I can't, that would be unethical because it's a civil rights issue. If I can't see all people as equal and help them, then that's something wrong with me. I need training to change that, right? That's a civil rights issue. I think we'd agree with that. I think, gosh, anybody who would not care for somebody because of race, you would say, well, as soon as they changed sexuality to a civil rights issue, it changed it from a moral issue, a choice issue, at least in the way society sees it, to a civil rights issue. And that changes lots of stuff. And even though it was a pretty subtle thing that took place in academia, it's funny, the ramifications of this are still echoing into other areas. So as I'm overweight, I'm part of a obese minority. Maybe that's a majority. Maybe people are, but do I have rights because of that? When you start using that language in America, at least, it comes with the civil rights. And once that shifted, that created a really odd place for us to even have conversations like this. That's why, it must break our Lord's heart to hear people say, oh, Christians are bigots. I mean, what could be further from the truth? God the Father chose the incarnation to take place in a Jewish society that was an oppressed people group who were in occupied territory and to a poor family. God didn't choose to show up. He chose to show up in the most in probably the least likely place that would say so much about God's nature. And yet, now you have people saying things like, well, Christians are bigots. I think, we're the antithesis of bigots. Our faith was founded by, our original, that Abraham was a nomad, we are from a group of misfits and people that have been oppressed. One of the themes of the Bible is exile. People are in exile all the time. God's people were out of their home. And then for somebody today to say, who obviously doesn't know what the Bible says, and have them just speak, oh, well, Christians, they're a bunch of bigots. That's so, I can't think of almost a more offensive way to describe the God of the universe who is the opposite of that. And so that's the context that we find ourselves in. A couple of things that you need to understand, that ultimately the way I'm going to talk about gender tonight, it is not a cultural issue. It is a theological issue. Gender is pre-fall, meaning that before there was sin in the world, there was male and female, part of God's design. And everything before fall, everything before sin entered in, has to do with God's glory. And so that would say to me that there's something about masculinity and something about femininity that, if understood correctly, is a complementary engagement of male and female that say something about the very nature of God. I'm going to talk about some of that in just a few minutes, but we don't think it's a social construct. And I want to tell you, if you've got anybody under the age of maybe 25, they have been told their entire life that gender is a social construct, and if they go to a counselor and they're uncomfortable about anything, and do you know a 15-year-old in this world who's not uncomfortable about almost everything? Do you know of a 14-year-old kid who isn't confused sexually in our society? But you go to a healthcare provider in our country today and say, and you're 15 or 16, you say, I'm kind of suicidal, or I'm really struggling with depression. Their go-to is going to be, I think there's a gender problem here. You need to come out and you'll be more comfortable. And the odd reality is what happens, most of these kids feel like they don't belong, which is pretty universal for 15-year-old people in this world. But the cure our society has given, a kid comes in and says, I don't belong. They say, oh, okay, well, we'll fix that. We'll make you transgender. And then they will never belong. You can say what you want, but that's the arc of history. Creation is on our side. The arc of history has not made this, what the textbooks will now describe, the textbook's often a textbook on human sexuality in a college campus today will talk about gender as a non-binary, and they would talk about the idea that there's not male and female, there's a little more male, a little more female, a little more, and it would be just this kind of curve, or more, I guess, more a slope line and that's not reality. That's not what research says. That's not what the numbers say. We're going to be talking about the difference between, so we're talking about this as a theological issue. Real quick, the Bible, if we're going to be talking, at the end of the day, we're going to kind of go through things like homosexuality and behavior and all sorts of stuff about sexuality. You do need to know one last theological thing, just because usually the arguments you need to know this to understand the arguments that you'll hear. You need to know the difference between moral law, civil law, and ceremonial law. So in the Bible, there are laws. And those laws will all follow into three categories. Moral law, which applies to all people, all times, all societies, all cultures. The Ten Commandments are moral law. You can't say, well, don't lie is really just for this group. That's moral law. And therefore it goes beyond, it goes beyond, it's moral law. And so when you see something written, women cover your head in church services. Paul tells to do that. Now, is that a moral law that every woman should cover her head? Is that a ceremonial law that says something like much of Leviticus, and so much of Leviticus in the Old Testament talks about clean and dirty and clean and unclean. And the reason for that is that God is concerned about clean and holiness, not clean fingernails, but he used that sort of language to say, hey, I'm about holiness, cleanliness. Something needs to clean us when we're dirty. And so they have all these rituals in the Old Testament about, what to do if somebody's got a rash, and how a woman should be during her period, and those are ceremonial laws. And the fact that they're laws that were given to that society at that time that point to something. There's something in that we can learn about the nature of God and how we should act, but we don't have to follow those because they're ceremonial laws. And the third would be civil laws. And in some cases, the Bible is an incredible document written for all time, but it is written in a specific place and time. And because of that, there are some things that have to do with the law of that day. And so a lot of the debates among Christians who already believe, we believe in the Word of God, what do we do with some of the things in the Bible that talk about gender and sexuality? A lot of the arguments come down to what is moral, civil, and ceremonial law. Does that make sense? And so not everybody who does, I have a very conservative understanding of gender and sexuality. But not everybody somebody who might be just one step over this way doesn't necessarily mean that they're not a Christian. They may be looking at one of those, they may be looking at something that I think is a moral law. They may see it as a ceremonial law. And however, I want them to have done the work. I want them to look at the Bible and study the language and see what it really says, as opposed to, it makes me more comfortable. It fits society better if I pick this. Instead, so don't throw everybody under the bus who doesn't completely agree with you, but be aware that when it comes to gender and stuff, that's in play. Does that make sense? I realize that was just a lot of high-sounding theological gibbery-gish to many of you. You say, well, just tell me what I'm supposed to do with my neighbor who looks at porn every day, and we'll get to that. But let's just talk about. It's funny. if you were just to listen to our society, and by the way, our society is in a race for who's the victim. I've mentioned this before in this class, but the Bible has such a more robust way of talking about people. In our society, it's a race to being a victim because everybody is either in one of two categories in our world. Everybody is either a victim or a persecutor. And since I don't want to be a persecutor, I'll figure out I'm going to make a race to the victim. And it's funny, I mean, both political parties, Donald Trump is appealing to the fact that white farmers are victims. And, we've been overlooked and we're losing. And the Democratic Party is looking at other groups and saying, you're the victim. And it's just this race to victimization. That's not what the Bible teaches about your nature and my nature. The Bible has a much more robust and a little bit more complicated than either you're a victim or an agent or a victim or a persecutor. The Bible would say that I'm a sinned against sinner, which means I'm both a victim and a persecutor. That I'm capable of both dignity and depravity. As an image bearer of God, there is a part of me that has the ability to harm others. And living in a fallen world, I've been harmed by others. And so the Bible has such a more healthy way of describing people than you're a victim or you're a persecutor. It would say, well, you're both. You're a sinned against sinner. And so that's why, so that's just kind of a way to think about what we're doing. If you were to listen to people today, most people in academia would say that women are oppressed and men are the oppressor. And some men have been very oppressive. But do you know that 9 out of 10 prison inmates are men? Out of the homeless population, it's 3-to-1 men to women. Men are 10 times more likely to commit murder than women. Men are more likely to end up in the lower end of the distribution of IQ scores. Men are more likely to abuse and abandon their children. Men are less likely to take care of their aging parents. Men outscore women on measures of cruelty, closed-mindedness, hostility, narcissism, and self-indulgence. Men die on an average 5 years earlier than women. Men are distributed with more variance along the basic traits, weight, height, and intelligence. 92% of Americans who die on the job are men. So I'm not sure that men are, if you're just to hear the media, you would think, well, boy, I tell you what, men have it easy, women have it horrible. And the truth is, women have been abused. Women are more likely to be sexually abused and raped than men. Women are more likely to be paid less than men. Women are likely to be more depressed than men. Men are more like women. So just to think about how funny some of the assumptions our world has about everything. And I'm not saying men have it easier than women or women have it easier than men. The Bible would suggest that men and women are different. And therefore, we're going to have a different set of issues that go on. Now, please hear me when I say this. Men and women are more alike than they are different. I mean, there's more similar about us than there are differences about us. But I think the differences are pretty significant. I had a friend who taught biology once say, did you know that chimpanzees are only 4% different than humans? And then he looked at me and said, it must be a pretty important 4%. I mean, because I'm not picking lice off of you today no matter what, and we're not just going to sit and throw our feces at each other because we don't do that. But if we were all chimpanzees, that's kind of what it would look like after about an hour in here. And so it may be only 4%, but it is a significant 4%. And I think the same is true for men and women. It says in the Bible that God created men and women in his image. And so let's pull back from that and look at that assumption theologically. That would mean there's something about there's something about God that biblical femininity might speak to better than masculinity, and there's something about God that might be spoken to better by masculinity. And so you just look at the trends of what our men tend to be like, what do women tend to be like, and see what that might say about the nature of God. Now, I could solve a lot of theological problems by understanding that God, on the canvas of Eden, he said, everything will say something about my glory. Everything will say something about my holiness, my power, my beauty, my design. All of creation will shout of my glory. And there's some things about God that's a little hard for humans to fully understand. Is God knowable or is God mysterious? Yes. Did God choose us or did we choose him? A good Presbyterian would say God's sovereign and he did all the choosing, but he did all the initiating. But there is a way in which that idea of the responsibility of man versus God's movement. I was just with the Ukrainian staff of Campus Crusade for Christ, and we talked about laments. And most laments tend to ask the question, is God good? And is God going to show up? Those seem to be the two deepest questions when people are wrestling with the struggles in their soul. Well, I would suggest to you that gender answers all the questions I just said. So what if you are a God and you have the entire canvas of creation and you are the definition of creativity and everything is about your glory and you made humans in your image and you did the same thing you'd done with the rest of creation. You were complementary in the way you made. And what is it about masculinity? Now, I'm painting with a very broad brush, but just stay with me. There's something about masculinity that is supposed to show up. One of the traits of masculinity, one of the things that is an aberration to masculinity is passivity. There's something about biblical masculinity that shows up and names animals and does what it's supposed to do. There's something about biblical. I need we need an interpreter. I'm just kidding. That wasn't speaking in tongues. Don't worry. I just make a charismatic joke every once in a while, just for my good friends. I love them. I think they're wonderful, and I know their background. So every once in a while, I'll just make a Pentecostal joke just for them. And no problem. I just want you to know we're glad you're here. But in biblical femininity, there's something about invitation. In biblical femininity, God invites. In biblical masculinity, God pursues. Which one does he do? Both. But it makes my mind blow up. Does he know, is he pursuing or is he inviting? Oh, both. How could you put both of those in creation? Well, you could say, hey, I'll create man and woman in my image. And women, femininity, will tend to be about, what's the fallen nature of invitation? Seduction. And so in biblical femininity, there's an invitation. There's something about femininity that invites. There's something in masculinity that pursues. There's something in masculinity that is knowable. There are comedians that make a living on these two facts: the mysteriousness of femininity and the knowableness of masculinity. You can just get on YouTube and put in, clean comedy about men and women, and it'll be, I can't figure out my wife. It'll be like it'll be hours of just basically saying, my wife is a mystery. Nobody. We had a fight for 6 hours about potato chips, and he's just, and basically he's making a fortune saying, femininity is mysterious. And here's the wild things that happen because of it. There are just as many female comedians out there that are making a fortune on basically saying, my husband is predictable. You know, he's knowable. I mean, I should have known all he wanted was to go out on the boat, or, you know, all he wanted was food, or he wanted wings. So, you know, those are, you know, I'm just speaking of my own. So I would suggest to you that gender is a theological construct that was supposed to say something to the world about the very nature of the God of the universe. And before we talk about what men can do and what women can't do and what men can do and women can't do, we should always begin that discussion with the dignity of God's design. That femininity says something about the nature of God and masculinity says something about the nature of God. What are some things that femininity says about God's nature? Creativity. We serve a God who puts flowers on the top of mountains that people will never see. We serve a God who paints behind the refrigerator. I mean, you just can't help but look at when you see photographs of the universe and you see the complexity and the beauty and the fact that these planets are, you know, so many light years away, you go, whoever created this painted behind the refrigerator. I mean, we didn't need this, but he's that creative and thorough. And there's something about, can men be creative? Sure. There's Rembrandts out there, and there's men that can be really creative, but I just want to tell you, I can always tell the difference between a conference that, I mean, I used to speak a lot of different places, and I can always tell the difference between when a woman's been in charge of that and when a man's been in charge of it. You know, with a man, it's like, well, we're going to have, I love speaking at men's retreats because it's like people bring buckets of food they just got from the drive-through and bags of chips and 2-liter Coke bottles. I mean, it's just, you know, and then you can always tell when a woman's been in charge because there's a theme. And now, are there women who hate that? Yeah. Are there men who would like a theme? Yep, I'm sure there are. But in general, there's something about creativity that's kissed by femininity in a way that masculinity doesn't. There's something about invitation. There's something about mystery that is kissed by femininity that isn't that way as much as masculinity. Nurture. And by the way, the Bible does usually refer to God in a masculine form, but not always. Remember in Zephaniah when it says, as a hen gathers her chicks, so is God with his children. God used a female metaphor to describe himself because, why? Because nurture is better understood if you talk about female than if you talk about male. It's not that men can't nurture. I love my grandchild, Cedar, and we're about to get a new grandchild, a second grandchild, and that child will be spoiled as well. But there's just to see my wife's eyes when that grandbaby's around, it's like there's something deeper in that than me. So I'm not going to spend, we could do an entire night on what do you see in femininity and what does it say about the nature of God? What do you see in masculinity and what does it say about the nature of God? And it'd be a great conversation. But I think one of the reasons that there's a real sadness in me about the way our culture has gone is this is another one of those areas where Satan has stolen a metaphor or a picture in Scripture and has now made it really even hard to use as one of those things. Same thing happened when, I used to work with a lot of inner city kids, and I remember a person saying, don't talk about their father, because a lot of them don't have fathers at home. And I thought, gosh, don't take that metaphor away. Don't take that away. And Satan is carefully taken away carefully taken away some of the things that I think God wanted to use to describe himself. in a large, if you were to look at the science about gender, you would find that men and women do have differences. In personalities, women are higher on agreeableness, friendliness, niceness, they're more cooperative. Men are more aggressive than women in both physical and verbal aggression. Men are less conscientious, less dependable, and less responsible. Women are slightly more emotional. They're about equal on happiness and equal on how satisfied they are. Women are probably slightly ahead of men when it comes to verbal ability. Men are slightly ahead of women in math problem solving. But women are slightly ahead of men when it comes to computation. Men seem to show a slightly higher ability with special tasks, rotating an object in their mind. Generally, men are more casual about sex than women. Women are obviously more invested in parenting than women. That's what the research says, that men and women are different. What you find, though, is there's a kind of a gender leveling thing going on in our society where there's no difference between men and women. There's no difference. There's no difference between men and women, and that's, physically that's not true. But any honest parent raising a boy and a girl will notice the difference because of the aggression that would come more likely with a boy child than a female child. My son Skylar is kind of forever 7 years old. He's now 38. But I remember, and I've told this story before, but I remember when he didn't want to go back to one of the programs that they had for him, kind of like ACE here. He came home and he got a Nerf gun. And he started marching around our house. And he said, "I'm not ever going back there. They don't realize I'm a hero." I didn't teach him that. I didn't say, men protect their houses. I didn't say men protect. I didn't say that there's something about that inside him. And so we have creation on our side. Gender is part of God's design. Before men and women were cursed, they were divided. They were separated, and they were with different tasks and different things to do. When the serpent attacked, he did it gender specifically. He went after Eve. And the sad thing, probably the first sin of a man in the Bible is the fact that he was silent, standing next to Eve while Eve was being tempted. It's like, where were you, Adam? You knew better. Why didn't you speak up? Passivity is the struggle of masculinity that's fallen. And so the idea of gender, we ought to talk just a moment about what does the curse in the Bible is gender specific. There's a different curse for men and for women. So the Bible does not teach that men and women are so different that there's nothing about them that connect. Well, there's a lot that connects, and we see that in science. A man and a woman are biologically more alike than they are different. However, there are significant differences, and those differences we ought to pay attention to because those differences might be part of what God is trying to say you need to look at in both so that you see a picture more fully of who he is. Does that make sense? So when the fall happened, that messed up everything. And so it meant that men were going to struggle with their masculinity and women are going to struggle with their femininity, and that's part of the curse. Men are asked to be gardeners, and the curse of a man is that there'll be thorns and thistles in his garden, and so the struggle for masculinity is with feeling inadequate. And if you're a woman, if you don't know that the struggle of every man you deal with is inadequacy at their very core, that's the question of a man is, do I have what it takes? Can I pull this off? Can Can I be a gardener when there's thorns and thistles? Because I was made to name animals, and as you know in Hebrew, to name something is to define it, and that first task of maleness, and yet because of the curse, I struggle with with the task given to me. A man's great struggle is that he was made to live for the glory of God, and man's great struggle would be with inadequacy. And so when a man feels inadequate, he tends to withdraw from relationship. And he can withdraw passively by being a little boy that plays all the time. And if you know somebody in a marriage like this, they'll sometimes say things like, well, we have 3 children, and if you count him, it's 4. And that's because the way her husband is dealing with his fallen masculinity is he's just a little boy, and he withdraws from relationships by being a little boy. There's also the macho jerk way over on the other side, and he's real aggressive in his withdrawing from relationships. But the struggle for fallen masculinity is to pull away from relationship, because the man's greatest fear is that he will be weightless, that his life will not have mattered. If you were to push me about my greatest fear today, it would be that when my son dies, there wouldn't be enough money to take care of him after I die. Because if that were the case, I failed at the most important task I was given by God. And that haunts me. Because what that will say is my life really didn't matter. There wasn't the weight to it that there should have been, because I did not accomplish that task. And the fear of every man is a sense of weightlessness. I won't have mattered. I mean, I do the primetime Bible study here, which is really just a Bible study for a bunch of old guys like me. And the struggle for almost all of them is they're looking back on their life and say, is this all there is? And do I have any purpose left? I mean, what? Does my life matter? And the answer is yes, yes. God's left you here for a reason. But that's the struggle of masculinity, is do I have what it takes? And since I'm afraid I don't, I feel impotent. I feel inadequate. I feel unequipped. So I'll withdraw. And I'll only fight battles I know I can win, and I'll only pick arenas and I'm going to falsely find significance in things like, I mean, there's nothing wrong with playing fantasy football, but it doesn't really even exist. And mostly men are playing that. Mostly men play video games. Women sometimes play video games. I get that, and that's fine. But why are men playing video games? Because video games are set up to make someone feel adequate. So you can learn a level, and then you kind of get to the next level. And if you can't get to the next level, you make it easier for you, and eventually you get to the next level. And what does that make you feel like? Whoa, I've just won something. And there's men spending hours, fighting dragons that don't exist, playing guitars that don't exist, playing guitars that have little buttons on them that don't even really work. And they're playing Guitar Hero and Halo and I mean, they're fighting things that don't exist. But what is it feeding? It's feeding that sense of you're making a difference. Because your emotions don't know the difference. So your emotions kind of go, hey, you feel pretty good. I'm on level 7. I got Zelda's sword. And it's like, Zelda doesn't exist. There is no Zelda's sword. Those dragons are just, they're no real dragons. But you tell that to, I remember when Pierce was younger, that's my other son, and Pierce was younger, he's really a good musician. And he and his buddies would come over to our house and they'd play, I know that it's not a big game anymore, but they'd play Guitar Hero. If you've ever seen Guitar Hero, It's the dumbest game I've ever seen in my life. It's got a plastic guitar with like 4 buttons on it, a red, a blue, a green, and then you watch the screen and it plays some rock song, and you're supposed to press the button when it passes a spot. And if you do it enough, it'll say, "You're a rock star. You're really ripping it." I want you to know that even though this isn't a charismatic thing I make fun of, she has been laughing and looking at you the whole time. So I don't know what that means. I don't know what that means. But I remember coming into Pierce one day, and I just had enough. I mean, these guys were, "Oh, you're a level 7. And there's no such thing. There's no such thing. And I remember finally, I shouldn't take it anymore, and I came in and said, "There's a real guitar in this other room. If you spent half as much time with a real guitar, you guys could write songs. You could change the world. I mean, this is crazy." It's like, "Oh, Dad, leave us alone." It's like, where's rock stars? What? Now, do women play those games? Yeah. Typically, who plays those games? Men. What is it? Why? It feeds that sense of adequacy, that sense of, it feeds that thing that ultimately God wants to feed in a masculine soul. And so, understand that about men. About women, the greatest fear is they'll be invisible, that they will offer who they are, and they'll either be used, abused, ignored, or not seen. And if men are struggling for significance, women tend to struggle for security. Not all. Do men struggle with security? Yes. Do women struggle? Yes. But in general, if you were to take the general population of men and women, you would find that there's different issues going on with them. In our world, they only pick the research that fits what they want. Can both a man and a woman be a good medical doctor? Yeah, of course. There's some really good women doctors. There's some good man doctors. So it's all the same. No, it isn't. The research on why a woman chooses to be a doctor and why a man chooses to be a doctor says that they choose often for a different motivation. Men tend to choose being a doctor for what reason? For significance. Now, do they want to make a difference in the world? Do they want to help people? Yeah. But they tend to pick that career for significance. Women tend to pick that career for nurture. They want to make a difference. They want to love people. They want to care for people. And they both make good doctors. But at the core, the question, when people start hearing, whenever you say something's different, the natural human response is, which one's better? And God would say, that's the wrong question in my creation. In my creation, the wrong question is night better than daylight? Is land better than water? In my creation, that's the wrong question. I created both for my glory, and they connect in a complementary way. And that's what the Bible teaches. And it's kind of interesting. Just a couple of thoughts as we kind of move down. I've given a kind of idea of gender, and so be aware what you want to do. If somebody comes into your office or and they start doing the gender identity thing with you, that I don't feel like a man or woman. If it's somebody who's under the age of 18, just try to hold them off. Say, well, why don't you just wait? Don't make a decision about that. I wasn't sometimes into the stereotype, because ultimately what they're saying is, I don't fit the stereotype of a man. I don't fit the stereotype of a woman, and that's okay. In my day, there were a lot of people that didn't fit the stereotype, and they would be tomboys or artsy guys or whatever you want to say. They ended up being fine. And that's because they weren't told when they were 15, oh, this is a sign that you're really a woman. Or this is a sign you're really a man. And so if you have somebody, remember you've got creation on your side, and you want to try to get them to hold off and normalize the idea of normalize the idea of it's hard, it's difficult, it's hard to fit in. You know you don't belong. But maybe the problem isn't gender, maybe the problem is something else. Kind of remember when you're dealing with somebody, kind of remember the acronym, the VET. Validate if you can, have empathy if you can, and then tell the truth. Somebody comes and says they, validate what you can. Can't validate everything. Have some empathy, and then speak the truth. Remember that phrase, VET. Validate, empathize, and then tell the truth. So I've tried to present to you, let's just talk about a biblical view of sexuality real quick, and then we'll talk about how this gets all twisted and what you'll feel, what will happen when you are going to want to do some counseling in these areas. The world has some basic assumptions about sexuality that most people under the age of 35 probably wouldn't even question. One of our problems is we've not questioned the world's assumptions about sexuality. And what we've tried to do is we've tried to place Christian behavior or obedient behavior on faulty assumptions. Here are the assumptions that people have about sex in our society. Sex is for self. Sex is primarily about pleasure. Sex can't be controlled. Sex has no deeper meaning, it's just physical. Now, there's probably some other assumptions, but for the most part, all those assumptions, your kids have been taught. Sex is just physical. So it has no other deeper meaning. It's basically for self. It's primarily about pleasure, and you can't really control it. And those would be the assumptions that most people get about sexuality in our culture. As a matter of fact, if you said that to most 20-year-olds, they'd go, well, yeah. Of course. I mean, those are, with the exception of one of those, they're all the opposite of what Scripture teaches. With the exception of the one about pleasure, which is only half true. So sex is for self. That's the world's assumption. That's what the Bible teaches. The Bible would teach that her body's not her body, it's your body. Your body's not your body, it's her body. So the Bible would teach that biblical sexuality is a picture of ministering to somebody instead of manipulating them to meet your needs. And we're going to talk like adults here, and so think about the way God designed us. Men can go through the sexual response cycle in just a matter of moments. Again, I'm not trying to be offensive, we're adults here. The penis can be fully engorged in a matter of moments. And a man can go through that full response cycle very quickly. And is aroused by sight. A woman typically, not always, but typically is aroused by touch. And to go through that sexual response cycle, for the vagina to be fully engorged takes about 14 minutes. And so, there's actually people who do research on that. It seems kind of creepy to me. But every time I've ever said that in a lecture, every man goes, 14 minutes. Okay, now I know. But so God designed, we'll cut that out of the tape, by the way. Well, so God designed men and women either as a cruel joke. I got an idea. I'm going to tell them to love each other, but it's going to make them very different. Or maybe, just maybe, our incredibly creative and gracious God said, I'm going to actually paint covenant in the very essence of the physicality that I've created between men and women. What is a covenant? A covenant says, hey, I'll do my part whether you do your part, right? The covenant, remember when Abram has And so back in the old days when they would do a covenant, they would slice an animal and they'd make a sacrifice, and then the person would walk through it. And when they do that, they essentially are saying, I'm going to do my part whether you do your part or not. And then immediately the person walks through the other side, I'm going to do my part whether you do your part or not. That's what you do when you say your vows at a wedding. You're essentially saying, I'm going to be in a covenant with you, not a deal. See, a deal is, I'll do my part if you do your part. That's consumerism. I'll go to Ingles as long as they provide for me food at a pretty good price and it's convenient. If they start jacking the prices up, they didn't do their part, I'll go to Kroger's, because that's a consumeristic way of seeing the world. God is covenantal God, and so God sets up, and so he sets up in marriage in sex, he sets up her body is not her body, it's your body, and it's different from yours. And your body is not your body, it's her body, and it's different from yours. And so there's this what's supposed to take place in Christian sexuality is kind of a, no, not me, you. No, not me, you. No, not me, you. No, not me, you. And somewhere in the middle of this selfless dance of sacrifice and ministering to the other, there's supposed to be this kind of erotic engagement. Now, is most Christian marriages like that? No. Is my marriage always like that? No. Is that God's design? Yeah, it is. That sex is not about self. Sex is about the other. And so, because essentially you realize in every relationship you have a choice from this moment on. In every relationship, I can either minister to you to meet your needs, or I can manipulate you to meet mine. God never intended your spouse to meet all your needs. And so what's supposed to happen is, God, I'm not going to put the pressure on my spouse to meet all my needs. I'll bring that to you, and now let me minister to them. And when that's going on, the other spouse is supposed to say the same thing. Wait a minute, he's not supposed to meet all my needs, because that's impossible. You never wanted a human being to meet all my needs. And so I'm going to trust you with my deepest needs and try to minister to them. And that's a biblical understanding of sexuality. It's not a for self, it's for the other. It's covenantal. It's minister, don't manipulate. I mean, that's radical. The Christian view of sexuality is beautiful, erotic, engaging, and we don't whisper it from the pulpit. And the world's view of sexuality is an absolute bankrupt mess. And they shout it from the mountaintop. Second assumption that I said the world had is that sex can't be controlled. And so what we do is we hand out condoms to high school kids and say, you can't control yourselves, so just go ahead and, because sex doesn't mean anything, it's just physical. Boy, what a message we give kids at that point. There's nothing sacred. But the Bible would say right the opposite. The Bible would say this might be the most important area for you to discipline. Well, the book of Proverbs begins with a treatise. The first few chapters are a treatise on wisdom and foolishness, right? Then what is the first topic? After he's clearly talked about what wisdom is and what foolishness is and appealing to wisdom instead of foolishness. And I mean, those first introductory chapters, what's the first kind of topic in the book of Proverbs? The adulterous woman or the adulterer. And because once you understand what wisdom is and foolishness is, once you understand what God's standards are, now, hey, here's the place you need to be aware. What does Paul say about sex? Be aware of sexual sin because it goes to the very core of you. It's not that sexual sin takes the more blood of Christ than other kinds of sin. It's because it goes to the very core of your soul. And so this idea of sex is for self, that's not what the Bible teaches. It's for other. Sex can't be controlled. That's not what the Bible teaches. It says it's one of the most important things too. Sex doesn't mean anything. It's just physical. No. the Bible would say that sex creates oneness. And it's spiritual. Sexuality is not just physical. It has a spiritual implication. That's why sex, it's never about sex, it's about much more deeper things. The fourth one, it said that sex is about pleasure. And that is half true. I mean, God is the one that designed us sexually. And so there are more nerve endings in your tongue and in your genitalia than anywhere else in your body. There's a reason we don't rub elbows, when we see someone we deeply love, because there's no nerve endings there. There would be no pleasure in going, hey, that's a great set of elbows there. Because that wouldn't do any, there would not be any, there's no joy, there's no nerve endings. God designed it in a way so that if you were a kiss, it would go it would matter to you. It's amazing. It's amazing. Many people who were, many men and women who were involved in adult industry stuff. I actually, when I was in Orlando, had 2 different times had someone who'd become a Christian who had been involved in that world. And one of them said, I just didn't kiss people because that was too personal. So God did make us, there is pleasure is supposed to be a part of it, but it's not the goal. And that's the problem. One of the problems with sex for couples is that they think the goal is it's purely for pleasure or to have an orgasm, and so there's all of a sudden all this anxiety and pressure to do it right and to do it perfectly, and good luck with that. C.S. Lewis said that eroticism in America needs a belly laugh. That was almost 35 years ago. And how right he is. Right he is. He was pretty much right about almost everything. Even though he could not get through the presbytery to be a pastor of the PCA, I still think I'd go to his church. I'm just saying. So what I've tried to say is those are the world's assumptions, and I try to give you a Christian critique of those assumptions and giving you a Christian idea of that. And so if you understand this, it's helpful to know if you're dealing with people that are struggling. And I would just suggest to you that if you're having a conversation with somebody and they're a Christian couple and they're trying to do things right and they're having trouble in their sex life, I would say it's usually one of 4 things. It's usually anxiety about performance, and that has to do with misunderstanding the goal. The goal is not orgasm biblically, the goal is oneness. And so you can have a really successful sexual experience with your partner with or without orgasm because God's goal is oneness. But because he's a God who also wanted things to be kind of enjoyable and give you a reason to be engaged appropriately, he also made it with a possibility for it to be very enjoyable. The second reason is communication. Poor communication has killed many because we don't, it's funny, people don't talk about this much. Third is past experiences, pornography, sexual experiences, sexual abuse, shame, things in the past will have a way of coming back to haunt the present relationship. And sometimes for Christians, it's really difficult to go from the world's, the view sex is evil, sex is wrong, sex is bad, and then you get married and sex is good and it's wonderful and okay. And sometimes that's a difficult move to do in your brain in 24 hours. That this was wrong yesterday, today it's okay. That's sometimes difficult for couples, and it's really helpful if you're doing premarital counseling to kind of let them know that there's a real struggle sometimes. I tell couples that good sex is probably a 5-year warm-up. I tell that for premarital couples because I think you have to, I think for sex to be good, you've got to get over yourself. Because it's not about me, it's about the other. And it takes a while for you to get over yourself in this arena. Some people never do. So that's the second thing. Communication, anxiety about performance, communication. The last is technique. But the truth is, I think if you communicate well enough, technique kind of works its way out. If you can honestly talk about things with each other, I think technique kind of works its way out. Like, well, that wasn't pleasant. And if the guy can, or the woman can kind of not take that personal, but say, okay, what, that's, then you can kind of deal with the technique. But just be aware of that. So what I've tried to present so far is, though we don't talk about it much, when you're dealing with this arena, you and I have the correct story. We have the right understanding. We're the only people with hope in this area. We've got healing there's a beauty that God invites us to in this arena that the world doesn't have. So kind of always be aware, even when somebody's talking to you about gender, I'm just more this or more that, just that you've got creation on your side. Which you want to help if you work with single people a lot, you want to help them create ways and to become aware of how can they live out their masculinity or their femininity without sex. Because there's masculinity and femininity is not just about sex. And so if I'm dealing with somebody who's not married, what are some ways that a man can be a pursuer, an engager, in ways that, and not passive, in ways that, in his life. And that will kind of speak to masculinity, even if they're not able to be sexually involved or sexually active. You realize the reason pornography is so engaging to people, let's talk about it for men first, is pornography allows a man to experience the seduction of femininity without the cost of pursuit of masculinity. So what a man can do is a man, and again, we're talking about male-based pornography. One of the fastest areas in pornography is female-based pornography. Now, but so a man's feeling inadequate. Man's feeling like nobody thinks much of him. He doesn't think, well, he can quickly get online now or get on their phone or their computer and immediately find imagery of somebody wanting him. Matter of fact, most male pornography follows this scenario. An ordinary guy just sitting around doing ordinary things, orders a pizza, knock on the door, there's this beautiful woman holding the pizza box. She can't control herself. She throws the pizza away, rips off her clothes, and wants to have sex. Now, it might be a doctor, a dentist, a school teacher, whatever, but that's the basic scenario. Now, listen, I've been ordering pizza for 60 years. First of all, I've never seen a pizza delivery person that was attractive. I mean, I'm just saying, maybe if you've delivered pizza, then you're probably an exception to that, but I've never seen one that's attractive. And never have I seen anybody who delivered my pizza who then looked at me and went, hey baby, woo woo. That has never happened in my existence. And so I'm just saying, what that scenario invites is an inadequate man to falsely feel wanted, admired, and respected without any cost of their soul. So, the man at the strip club tonight doesn't want too much sex. They'll settle for a stranger pretending they care about him because they just want, what does Proverbs say? Beware of the adulterer. She reduces you to a loaf of bread. They're in there wanting, and this woman would walk up to, you're a handsome guy. If the two of us were sitting at one of those establishments tonight, you would think, well, all the girls will come up to him because he's good looking and younger, and I'm an old guy. Nope. They'll come to whichever one they think has the money. Because it's not about love. It's not about passion. It's not about, I can't control myself when they're around you. What Proverbs says is, she has reduced me to a loaf of bread. And it's not that the guy sitting at that place this week wants too much sex. He settles for a stranger pretending she's interested instead of doing the hard work that requires pursuit and engagement and strength and movement. Pornography can give you it can give a man a quick, almost like a video game can give you a quick, false sense of significance. When I deal with men that are struggling with pornography, I don't think they've gotten there yet when they just say, I'm going to try really hard not to, because they'll probably look again. It's when you've faced their deepest longings and they realize looking at pictures of strangers pretending they care about you as your source of delight and happiness is boring and completely unsatisfying. And when a man says to me, I've been looking at this for years and I'm bored, I have great hope for them, because they've realized that to use the Jeremiah passage, their broken cisterns don't hold water anymore. What does it say in Jeremiah? My people have committed two sins. They've turned their back on me, the source of living water, and they've dug for themselves broken cisterns that don't hold water. And that's just a beautiful picture of when people are deeply thirsty. Their tendency is to not trust God with that deep thirst, but instead to develop their own broken cistern, their own well, their own way to get their water needs met. But it's a broken cistern that doesn't hold water. And that's what pornography is. If you want some interesting resources on that, by the way, you need to be aware of this in our church. I have a group that meets on Thursdays called Peter's Fire. And we know that Peter probably was in a fire all the time, but we know of two fires that were recorded. One, when he denied Jesus. And I would suggest he went into a fantasy. And he told this 15-year-old girl he didn't even know Jesus. And he lived in a fantasy because that was safer than living in the truth. And the second fire we know Peter was at is when he was reinstated at the end when Jesus at the shoreline. And so we call this group Peter's Fire, and it's a resource for the church. We don't meet at the church because if you said, hey, we have a porn group, come on to the church, no man would show up. So we don't meet here. We meet at a house not far from here. And it's a meeting for men to face the false narrative that they bought into that I really can't live in a way that brings me love, but I can get selfish and find that sense of false sense of purpose that really you're made for more. You're just made for more. If you were just to talk about pornography honestly and say, so here's what's going to happen. You're going to sneak in a room. You're going to look at pictures of people who don't really care about you and don't know you. Though there is a line that if you cross, it can be more interactive, but still. They're reducing you to a loaf of bread. And then you're going to masturbate alone in a room, and then you're going to feel incredible shame, and then you're going to try to hide all that, and then you're going to go back out and try to relate to your wife and children, and well, you've just knocked the legs out from under you. You're just not going to live with that kind of strength after you've sold yourself for such a cheaper product. Lewis said that it's not our problem is not that we want too much, we settle for too little, and that is true. So far, I've tried to give you what I would consider to be a Christian understanding of sexuality and gender. I've tried to give you I've tried to tell you some real practical things you can do when things are kind of, when these sort of things kind of happen in your life, or when you're talking to somebody about this sort of thing. I've not talked about homosexuality. I've not talked about, I've talked about a lot of things that I think are going on, but I have mentioned the addiction situation. Remember last week I talked about addiction, and I talked about it's a hijacking of the reward system. That works with pornography and everything as well. The brain begins to release endorphins when you respond to that, and then that changes the reward system, then works against your recovery than for your recovery.